So Inya, thank you very much for including my snapshot. Since you are one of the foremost experts on wax cylinders, which were recorded by Julius Block in Russia from 1890s to the 1920s, I will skip nearly all information concerning these recordings. And I think most of us are familiar with the collection which was issued in 2008 under the name of The Dawn of Recording. The aim of my intervention today is to put your attention to two cylinders which may be, or in all likelihood, have preserved the piano playing of one of the most famous pianists of all time, Anton Rubinstein. On these two cylinders, the baritone Vasily Samus sings one song of Rubinstein himself and one of Tchaikovsky. Most of the preserved cylinders of Block's collection were labeled with the names of the musicians, and such information normally was fixed in the handwritten inventory of Block. Unfortunately, the two cylinders in question do not mention the accompanist at the piano. One of the recordings, Tchaikovsky's Serenade of Don Juan, begins, like many other cylinders, with a short speech of Block, introducing the names of the artists involved. But here, these 10 seconds of spoken words are hardly audible at all. Recently, the Hungarian-born composer and pianist István Horváth Thomas, who has been living in Germany for more than 40 years now, has claimed that the pianist in these two recordings must be Anton Rubinstein. He communicated it to Marston, who enthusiastically reported this on his company's homepage, Ward Marston. But if there are no unambiguous indications pointing at Rubinstein, how can one be sure it is him who is playing? At first glance, there is almost no proof at all, as long as the introductory speech cannot be deciphered with absolute certainty. Horváth Thomas is convinced to hear the words Nade, Don Juan, Block, es spielt der Titan. He passed the recording to Hermann Künzel, professor for forensic phonetics at the University of Marburg, who tried different filters and finally could confirm at least two words, der Titan. These seem to be watertight. We know that der Titan was a widespread sobriquet for Rubinstein, and Block himself in his diaries nicknamed Rubinstein like this. Anton Rubinstein left a famous entry in Block's album in February 1890, Gare aux exécutants. He was strongly impressed by the recording machine and must have been present at some recording sessions. Yet the memories of Block, as well as those of other contemporaries, show that the idea of having him play for being recorded was ultimately not realized despite all efforts. I quote from Block's diary. At the time, many of my musical friends had been completely convinced of the importance of the phonograph as an ancillary to music. A conspiracy was afoot among them to get the Titan pianist, Rubinstein, to play for the phonograph. Tchaikovsky in particular had told him of the miraculous reproductions he had heard. No arguments would induce him to come and hear it. So a plot was hatched between us to take him by surprise. Safonov, professor at the Moscow Conservatoire, arranged a card party for him, and to this I was to bring the phonograph. During that time, Safonov and all his guests repeatedly asked him to consent and play into the phonograph. He would not listen to the idea. Pressed by his friends to give his reason, he said that he did not want to have his mistakes immortalized. An hour later, Safonov rushed into the room and told me Rubinstein had consented to let me take a record. But then an irreparable catastrophe happened. The accumulator gave out. All hope of recording that evening was gone. There is, quote end, there is no document which could testify that Rubinstein would have consented once again to play for Block's phonograph. So there is no real proof for our hypothesis. But there is plenty of circumstantial evidence. First, not only Block, but the complete bunch of Russian musicians gathered around him was eager to have Rubinstein recorded at all costs. There were two verified dates when Rubinstein was present together with Block and his machine. Second, as a matter of fact, Rubinstein once actually had been persuaded to do a recording. That is to say, he overcame his reluctance or superstition at least once. The failure of the recording due to technical problems is a secondary aspect. Third, as far as we know, Rubinstein's denial concerned soloistic performances. It seems conceivable that, placed in the second row as an accompanist, his refusal was less strict. Fourth, even if we exclude the overall qualities of the piano playing, its breathtaking virtuosity, its perfection, its expressiveness, the amount of improvised elements such as introductions or codas not written in the score is far above anything which happens on the other cylinder recordings. The licenses of all those other fin de siècle Russian musicians recorded on wax cylinders were considerable, but they did not extend to adding introductions or postludes, the more so if the music was from somebody as revered as Tchaikovsky or Rubinstein. Fifth, the baritone Samus was renowned for singing Rubinstein songs, and Rubinstein had made him inspector of the vocal classes at Petersburg Conservatory. The mere choice of the repertoire, Rubinstein and Tchaikovsky, points towards Rubinstein. Sixth, who else could have played like this? Sergei Taneyev, for example, had been recorded roughly around the same time, but his playing is strict and disciplined, and his whole attitude contrary to the idea of exuberance and improvised additions. Ex negativo, Rubinstein seems the only choice. In the end, Walt Marston on his homepage claims, quote, "We can never know for certain whether this is Rubinstein, but given this evidence added to what we hear in the playing, we think it is distinctly possible that Mr. Horvath Thomas is correct." I'm coming to the end. Methodologically, if there is no new attempt to get a better transfer from the original wax cylinders in Petersburg, we are ultimately confined to circumstantial evidence. Above all, to identifying hypothetically the style of interpretation of Rubinstein, which has been described by his contemporaries. There is not enough time to quote such documents here, but all of these descriptions unanimously speak of an overwhelming effect beyond comparison. I am sure anybody hearing the two cylinders will feel quite the same even today, 130 years later. But here we touch the field of psychology. I am well aware that the desire to hear one of the greatest musicians of the 19th century might damage scientific objectivity. Are we manipulated by our own expectations, by a hidden need for sensation? In 1979, Harold C. Schoenberg wrote in the New York Times about the might-have-beens of musical history. If the phonograph had been invented earlier, we could hear Chopin and Liszt at the keyboard. But there is no way back. Dream on, dream on. Now, if Rubinstein really is playing on block cylinders, this is not too far from listening Liszt. On YouTube, one commentary says, "You have found the Grail." I have finished here, and I would propose to hear at least a part of the Don Juan Serenade, if time still allows. Thank you.